everybody, this is Anna, or FennéCrafts if you prefer, and today I'm going to show you how to make a puffball fursuit tail. This is my first ever tutorial, and hopefully the first of many, so if there's anything you think I should improve on for future tutorials, just let me know down in the comments. This style of tail is meant to mimic the look of a tail that has been wrapped up in either ribbons or bands. It's not possible to do this with any regular tail because the tail will try to expand back into its regular shape, but the cylinders on this puffball tail help mimic that look and make it seem as if it is actually tied up properly. We will be doing a similar look with a gray wolf tail featuring 3 puffballs. You might have also seen me make this tail on an older suit of mine called Blonde Kitty. Although hers was a ginormous, we're going to do a simpler one that doesn't actually reach the ground. Basically, what we're going to be making here are what I would describe as being sections of a beach ball. If you've ever seen one before, it's usually 6 slices to make up a sphere. To begin, you need a pattern. I just use regular printer paper and fold it in half, and then I measure out how long I want my sphere piece to be. I don't leave it perfectly pointed on the ends because it's easier to sew. And I just draw out the shape of what looks kind of like half of a deflated football. And then I use my scissors to cut it out. This doesn't have to be entirely perfect, and I do add my seam allowances after the fact. Afterwards, you can begin tracing your pattern piece onto your fur. If you think you need to, you can go ahead and add some little arrows to indicate which way your pattern piece should be facing, but I did this all in one go, so I just never moved the pattern piece. I just kept dragging it over. Afterwards, you should have a total of 12 slices in order to make 2 spheres. And if you would like to keep your tail all one color, you could skip this step and just make another set of 6 cutouts. But I like to make the tip of my tail a different color, so I'm cutting off 4 inches worth of my original pattern so that I could place that on some ivory color fur and use it at the end of the tail. I'll use what's left of my gray piece and then just trace it out with the rest of the shapes. And once that's all done, I should have a total of 18 gray cutouts, 12 for their own spheres, and then 6 more for half of a sphere. Now you can begin cutting them all out. I prefer to use an X-Acto blade, but you do what works for you. When I cut, I actually really enjoy lifting the fur up while I cut and kind of just letting the blade glide through it. It doesn't let my blade touch the table beneath, and it keeps me from trimming off any little loose hairs that wind up getting underneath the blade. After that's all done, I have all of the little gray pieces cut out, and here you can see where I added the arrows, just because it makes it easier to sew them together afterwards. Here I'm tracing the lighter colored piece for the ends. Again, if you're not doing this and keeping it all one color, you could just skip this step. I also switched to a lighter color marker too. Here I am cutting out again, and it is easier here to see that I do lift up the fur. I don't know why, I just think it works much better this way. But again, it's, whatever you prefer. And here you go. The next thing is, you should brush out all the little excess hairs before you start sewing. And what I prefer to do when I'm sewing this together is to use a blanket stitch, but you're more than welcome to use whatever you want. You could just run it through the machine, or maybe do whip stitches and then run it through the machine. Whatever you think works best. It's really up to you. And there you go. It's all nice and tight, sewn together. Great on the back, seamless on the front. There you go. Now you officially have 3 sets of 6 slices to make your 3 spheres. Alright, and now you can start sewing them together. Now you can pin them if you're used to that, but I actually prefer to quote-unquote pin them together by stitching them together in certain places. I start by threading my needle through the center of the flattened ends, and then start working my way towards the direction of where I'm going to sew with my machine. And then I also do it to the other end, and then I do it in the middle, and then if there's more gaps, I put it in the middle of those gaps. I basically keep doing that until there's maybe 3 inches of space in between each gap. When you're working with larger pieces, it's good to keep the gaps close, but if you're doing it with just a small piece like this, just putting one in the middle would be fine, and that's what I am doing. This way it takes a little bit longer to do, but I think it's worth it in the end, because you don't actually have to remove them the same way you would pins. I can never keep pins from shifting around, but with this I don't have to worry about it. As long as your thread is thin, your machine can run right over it, and it doesn't show through the back of the fur either, so that's pretty nice. And there we go, just going through the middle. Like I said, it does take a little longer, but I definitely prefer to do it this way. Alright, now you just stick it under your sewing machine and start sewing. Just make sure you continue to push the fern like you would using any other method. I run my machine a little to the left of my knot just because that's where my seam allowance was. But like I said, if your thread is thin, it should be able to go over just fine. I have had problems with it where the thread was too thick and it jammed through the needle and it was a terrible experience. But so long as your thread is, average, it should be pretty fine. Now, basically you just keep repeating this step for all the rest of the pieces. I'm sewing on the 3rd slice right now. It does get a little bit more difficult as every piece goes on. If you prefer, you can do them 2 by 2 and then sew all the 2 sewn pieces together, but I prefer just doing it this way. If your slices are large, it should be a little easier to push them out of the way. If they're really small, you might start having trouble. It does get relatively easier as you keep going though. It's just a bit tedious doing this over and over and over again. Yay! Now at this point, you'll just have half of a sphere. If it kind of gives you an idea, it's starting to turn into that ball shape. Just continue doing this with every one, and eventually you should have 6 on each sphere. And there you go. It kind of looks like a deflated wasp nest or a sea urchin of some sort, but it should look something like this once it's finished. And when you're ready to close it up, put a notch halfway down and leave it halfway open at the end so that you can stuff it. I went a little farther on this one just for the purpose of making the hole smaller. It really only needs to be as big for my hand to fit inside. I also doubled down the thread at the end of it just to make sure that it wouldn't start popping open when I turn it right side out or when I start stuffing it. And there we go. Now you just start pulling it back right side out. And floof! You now have an unstuffed fuzzy sphere. It's hard to say. Yep. Now all that's left to do is start stuffing it. You could stuff it however stiff as you want it to be. I prefer mine to be kind of squishy. Also depends on what kind of stuffing you have. You may need to reshape it a bit. Just use a ladder stitch to close it up once you're done. And then, by the end of this, you should have 3 fuzzy spheres. Cute and fuzzy. Yep. Alright, up next, we need to make the pattern for the cylinders. This basically just involves measuring out one long rectangular shape, and then a perfect circle. I made mine 10 by 4, and then the circle I made was also 10 inches in circumference. I just cut them out, same as before. Now the next is to pick out your fabric. This is meant to be fabric, not fur. And I went with this material, which is actually a quilted material, so it's extra thick, so it will help hold the tail puffs together. If you don't plan on using a thick material like this, I would suggest backing it with something, maybe something tough like denim or another quilted material. Just place your pattern onto it and start tracing them out. And cut them out. Should be pretty easy to cut now that you actually get to use scissors. And in the end, you should have 6 little cylinder top and bottom patties. You should also have 3 rectangular shapes cut out. Obviously, you know, to finish off your cylinders. Just start running the rectangular shapes through the sewing machine. By the time they're all done, it should kind of resemble like a koozie. You know, those things you put around soda cans. I just start attaching the tops and bottoms by sewing them on with a blanket stitch. And again, if you would prefer to machine sew it, you can do that too. It also doesn't really matter too much what color thread you use for this because it won't really be visible once it's attached to the fur. And even then, blanket stitch hides threads pretty well. There we go. There is one of the tops, or bottoms, sewn on. When you get around to sewing in the other end, just leave a gap like that so that you can turn it right side out. And I left my thread attached so I could immediately just start sewing it up again after I stuff it. Make sure that your cylinder is all pushed out, and then start stuffing it full with stuffing. Polyfill, or whatever you prefer to call it. I just used a ladder stitch to sew up the rest of the cylinder. It may bunch up a little bit, considering that you are sewing a circle. Just try and tuck it in the best you can. And there you go. That is what a finished cylinder looks like. It's a little squishy, but that's, you know, just how they turn out. And don't worry too much if your cylinder is rounded off at the top, because it'll flatten out once you sew it up against the fur. As you continue sewing your cylinders, be sure to cut out 2 elastic strips and sew them to the top of one of the cylinders. It doesn't matter to which one, just so long as one of them, you know, has the elastic straps on them. This is just so that you can have something to run your belt through when you actually want to wear it. I prefer to sew them on the machine for this tail because it's a little bit heavy, and being that it's the cylinder attached to you and not the fur, it pulls quite a bit. I ran mine over my elastic several times just to make sure it had a pretty good strength to it. You can pull and tug on them if you want, just to make sure that they're doing pretty good. But as long as your sewing machine's good, you should be fine. And there you go. Not only do you have 3 puffballs, but now you have 3 cylinders and 1 with elastic. And now for the fun part, sewing it all together. Start with the elastic strap cylinder at the beginning, followed by the first puffball, second cylinder, the second puffball, the third cylinder, and then finally the last puffball. When you begin sewing, continuously loop thread between the center cylinder and the center of the puffball, and then pull hard. This will give some extra strength in the center. Then continue to go around the cylinder with a very tight ladder stitch using a heavy-duty thread. If your tail is very big, you will have to do this several times. After you get the first one on, it should look something like this. Kind of a mix between a Q-tip and a hairy lollipop, I guess. And then in the end, once everything is all together, it should look a little something like this. And there you go. That was how to make a puffball tail. I hope you guys liked this tutorial. If you want to see more stuff like this from me, just let me know in the comments. Also give me some suggestions of what you'd like to learn. I know a couple of people have been suggesting this tail, but other than that, only a couple of other things have popped up. So, thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, just let me know down in the comments. Hope to see you again soon. Bye!